Welcome to section 2.2 on resources. I'm Rachel Ellaway and your presenter for this session. All research, innovation, evaluation, all forms of scholarship use resources. They have costs, and therefore it's important to consider those costs in undertaking any kind of project. Now we can think about hard costs, which are actual money, real dollar values, real resources you need to have, but also the soft costs in terms of the time, effort, infrastructure, on cost, and other things you need to consider that you don't necessarily have to pay for indirectly in terms of dollars, but that still are used as part of doing this research. If you don't attend to and manage these resources, your wonderful ideas, your great ideas may come to nothing because you don't have the wherewithal to conduct the work that you really would like to do. In thinking about this, we can think about two dimensions. We can look at the actual dollar values, the real money costs, and then we can consider the other resources that are involved in conducting this kind of project. Now, in terms of money, we need to first of all think about what you actually need money for. First thing you need to think about is whether you need people. But if you do need people, they need to be very clear about who does what and who can actually go about doing it. So for instance, if you want to do the project entirely yourself, maybe you don't need any money for people at all. But if you need research assistants, particularly any research assistants that have, for instance, particular analysis skills or interview skills, then you need to have them. Maybe you don't need necessarily very trained people, but you need bodies, so students may be a good resource, particularly summer students. And if you have a particularly complex project, you may also be considering a project administrator, somebody who can look at the finance, do the project management on your behalf, and so on. Even if you don't hire anybody else, if you're a clinician, you may need to consider your own clinical time because you may need to get buyout to give you the time to do the project that you plan. So if you are thinking about this kind of project and you are a clinician, make sure that you do have the wherewithal either to buy your time out or that you actually have the free time within your plan to do what you want to do. Now you may also need to get equipment such as computers and recorders, microphones, other resources such as that. You may need software such as SPSS or NVivo, some kind of software that allows you to do the analysis that you want to do. And you may need some kind of space configuration, a private room, some kind of furniture or other resources, and you may have to pay for those too. There may be consumable costs such as printing or postage, things that your project will take up, particularly if you're doing survey-based research or something else, or if you need some kind of resource, say if you're doing simulation that you need the consumables for the simulation, all of those need to be factored in as well. And you may also be providing your participants with some kind of incentive. Now that might be as simple as providing pizza to students, or maybe more complex, such as providing individual gift cards to participants to encourage them to participate in your study. Again, those are costs you need to consider. And you also need to consider travel and subsistence, and those are going to be in two dimensions. The travel and subsistence to do the project, and the travel and subsistence required to disseminate the project. So if you have to travel, for instance, to cross the city or maybe leave the city, go elsewhere in Canada or beyond to do the project, then you need to make sure you have the wherewithal to do that whilst you're collecting your data. And once you've got your project done, you're looking to analyse it, then you might need to have some travel and subsistence resources to take your ideas, your findings to conferences and so on. So you need to think about all these kinds of hard costs. You also need to think about the things that are not necessarily directly fiscally related, particularly the time and effort required to undertake this research. So your time, particularly the time that's not billable, is still going to be time you need to put into it. So how much time will it take? How much of your time will this undertaking take? And how much time do you have to put into it or can make available? And be realistic about this. Don't overcommit to something when you know that realistically you can't actually put that much effort into the project. Think about it for each stage of the project in terms of designing and setting the project up, collecting the data, analysing it and reporting. For instance, qualitative analysis of data can actually take a long time and that resource needs to be factored into the project. Also bear in mind how much expertise you currently have and how much you need. So do you need to take a course? Do you need to go through some kind of training? And anything like that also needs to be factored into the project design as well. Now you may be able to draw on some resources you already have. So, for instance, you may have existing equipment or human resources that you can draw upon. So be clear what you already have, but also be clear what you can actually use it for and whether it can be legitimately used for research, particularly if it was acquired for some other kinds of purpose. You need to think whether it's actually a legitimate use of that resource for the kinds of things you have planned. Now, when you think about costs, you need to think about the total cost and resource impact, not just for you and the project, but for those who are going to be engaged with it, particularly the cost to participants, not just in terms of financial costs, which you're very likely to reimburse them, but the cost in terms of the time that you're asking them to be engaged in the project. And that's one of the key questions going through human ethics, is the impact on the participants, particularly in terms of time. You also need to think about the cost to colleagues, particularly if you're taking time out of your other work, so that you have obligations that you might not be meeting, and what's the impact on those around you. And that also goes to the impacts on the department and the school, the institution as well. There may be benefits from your research, but there may also be drawbacks, and some of those need to be considered as part of thinking about the overall cost of what you do. You draw all these things together in a budget, essentially an item-by-item description of the projected expenses for what you're planning to do. Each should follow from the protocol, and each scholarly act in the protocol should be accounted for. Each step in collecting data and analysing it and reporting it, including all the time that you're going to spend doing this. And by and large, it's important to, say, budget more than, say, 20 to 25% more than you think it's going to take to make sure that you do have the time and resources in place just in case there is project slippage. When you think about this, you need to look at above the lines expenses such as salaries and contracts. Anytime you engage a person to do something, then that's above the line expenses. And you also need to think about below the line expenses, which are all the other expenses incurred as part of this project. So that's the equipment and the travel and so on. When you're thinking about doing this, you need to come up with a budget format, and it really helps if you already have a template to work with. I think that the project proposal form from the University of Calgary is very helpful in this regard, because it takes you through each step and identifies all these costs and all the impact pieces that need to be considered as part of the approvals process. So this is a good template to use. When you identify that you need some resources to do the project, then you can think about where they're going to come from. Now, of course, you can do this pro bono for free as corner of the desk research, but there's only so much of that you can do without having a major impact on yourself and on others. So you need to think about the resources coming from somewhere else, and there may be personal research funds that you can draw upon. You may be able to go for competitive local funding or funding beyond the university. You may be able to get a commission to do a particular research, evaluation, or innovation project, which is very nice to have. Or you may be able to do this as part of a student project for a resident or an undergraduate student, so that some of the time and resource from the student is already committed because it's their project that's going through. Now, when you think about where you're going to get funding from, there are both internal and external sources. OHMS, the Office of Health and Medical Education Scholarship, provides funding, a project funding call once a year, and you can certainly apply to that. The Taylor Institute has a number of calls throughout the year for teaching and learning projects, and there may be departmental or other resources you can draw upon. If you go externally, there's the Tri-Council group, there's the CIHR for health, SHERC for humanities, and NSERC for the physical sciences. Now, they are good resources, but they are incredibly competitive, and therefore they're not necessarily very easy to secure. There are other national sources, such as calls from the Medical Council of Canada or the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. Canadians are eligible for a number of international calls, such as those from STEMLA, from the National Board of Medical Examiners in the United States. There are provincial calls from time to time, and you may also be able to draw on philanthropy to support your work. When you go for funding, you need to think about applying for it, making the case, and when you do, try to be as realistic as possible and as parsimonious. Only ask for what you need, but make sure that you do have enough to get the project done. Make sure the project is viable. In terms of securing the funding, you need to be clear about who gets paid, when they get paid, specifically what they get paid for, and the kinds of contracts and obligations that go with that. And when you have your resources, when you have your funding, then you need to be thinking about particularly what you're allowed to spend it on. So research accounting at the University of Calgary, it has a wonderful set of documents to describe allowable, eligible expenses in terms of research. And there will be some kind of reporting that goes at the end of this. So in summary, research and scholarship does use resource. It has costs, and these may be direct costs, particularly about what the project really costs in its entirety, which gives you an opportunity to try and pare it down to get it as focused and parsimonious as possible. It also requires you to think about the kinds of funds you need and where you're going to be able to get them from. You also need to consider the indirect costs both to you and to others. This can be captured in a budget, which is an essential part of making sure your project is viable. And in the end, there are many sources you can draw upon, but many of them are extremely competitive, which makes it very difficult to engage in some kind of project if you are entirely dependent on external resources. So I hope this has been useful in terms of thinking about the resource requirements, the resource dynamics within conducting a scholarly project. And we look forward to seeing you in the SHERI sessions.